You're not tired because you've done too much. You're tired because your mind never turns off. From the moment you wake up, you are already behind. Notifications, expectations, decisions, pressure to improve, pressure to keep up, pressure to not fall behind. You consume more information in one day than people used to in months. Advice, strategies, routines, systems. And yet, somehow, nothing really changes. You know what to do, but you don't do it consistently, and that gap quietly eats at you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in small moments. When you scroll instead of starting, when you delay what matters, when you break promises to yourself and tell yourself you'll fix it tomorrow. This is the hidden exhaustion of modern life. Not physical, mental contradiction. You are trying to move forward with a mind that is still wired for comfort, distraction, and survival. And no amount of motivation can fix that. Because the problem is not effort, it's alignment. You don't lack discipline. You don't lack intelligence. You lack a clear internal system that supports the life you say you want. Right now, your mind is running patterns you didn't consciously choose. Patterns shaped by environment, social media, comparison, past failures, and invisible beliefs you've never questioned. And those patterns are deciding your actions long before you do. That's why you can feel inspired one moment and fall back into the same habits the next. This audiobook is not here to motivate you. It's here to reset you, to help you see clearly what is actually controlling your behavior. Because once you see that, you stop fighting yourself. You stop relying on temporary emotion. You start moving with clarity. And when clarity replaces noise, something powerful happens. You no longer need to push yourself. It simply starts to make sense to move differently. Before we dive in, take a second to hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. You might be surprised to find someone listening from the same place as you. Chapter 1. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your beliefs. And most people misunderstand this in a way that keeps them stuck for years, without realizing why. They set goals with intensity. They write plans. They imagine outcomes. They feel a surge of motivation that convinces them this time will be different. But then, something subtle happens. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just a quiet return to familiar patterns. A delay here, a distraction there, a moment of hesitation that feels small, but repeats often enough to shape the entire trajectory. And eventually, the goal fades, not because it was impossible, but because it was unsupported. The surface tells one story. It looks like inconsistency, laziness, lack of discipline. But underneath, something else is happening. Something far more precise. Your behavior is aligning perfectly with what you believe is true. Beliefs are not what you say out loud. They are not the things you post, write, or even consciously affirm. Beliefs are what your actions default to when no one is watching, when no one is pushing you, when there is no immediate pressure forcing you to perform. They are the quiet assumptions that define what feels safe, what feels possible, what feels worth the effort, and what feels like a risk you should avoid. If you truly believed that your actions would compound into something meaningful, procrastination would feel irrational. If you truly believed that discomfort was temporary and necessary, avoidance would lose its appeal. If you truly believed that discipline was a form of freedom rather than restriction, consistency would not feel like punishment. But when the belief underneath tells a different story, behavior follows that story every time. This is not a failure of willpower. It is a matter of alignment. The mind is not designed to chase goals. It is designed to conserve energy and protect identity. Goals introduce change. Beliefs maintain stability. And when those two forces conflict, the system chooses stability. Always. This is why someone can say they want confidence, but hesitate to speak. Why someone can say they want success, but avoid visibility. Why someone can say they want discipline, but resist structure. On the surface, it looks like contradiction. But internally, it is coherence. The behavior is not random. It is consistent with the deeper belief. Someone says they want to be confident, but deep down, believes that confidence requires validation from others. So they wait. They analyze. They hold back until the environment feels safe enough to act. Someone says they want discipline, but believes discipline removes freedom and joy. So every attempt feels heavy, restrictive, and unsustainable. Someone says they want change, but believes change will cost them their identity, their comfort, or their belonging. So they stay where they are, even while feeling dissatisfied. The mind hears the goal, but it listens to the belief. And beliefs are powerful because they are invisible. They do not announce themselves as opinions. They present themselves as reality. They feel like truth, not interpretation. That is why advice often fails. Advice speaks to behavior. Beliefs decide behavior. You cannot outwork a belief you have not questioned. You cannot motivate your way past an internal system that quietly says, "This is not for you." You cannot force consistency when your deeper logic is designed to avoid what you are trying to pursue. Most people think they need more motivation. What they actually need is belief alignment. When your beliefs and your goals point in the same direction, effort feels lighter. It still requires action, but it no longer feels like internal resistance. There is no constant negotiation, no daily argument, no emotional weight attached to every step. You act because it makes sense, not because you are pushing yourself to override something deeper. But when belief and goal conflict, effort feels forced. Even simple actions feel heavy. The resistance you experience is not a flaw in your character. It is friction between what you say you want and what you believe is safe, possible, or deserved. And the mind is incredibly efficient at maintaining that internal consistency. If your belief system says, "People like me don't succeed in this area," the mind will generate excuses, fatigue, distraction, and doubt to keep reality aligned with that belief. Not because it is working against you, but because it is working exactly as designed. It protects what it thinks is true. Understanding this removes something critical: self-blame. You are not weak for struggling. You are not broken for repeating patterns. You are misaligned. And misalignment does not require shame. It requires awareness. The moment you stop asking, "Why can't I follow through?" and start asking, "What belief is making this behavior logical?" everything changes. The focus shifts from force to investigation, from frustration to precision. That is where real rewiring begins. Beliefs are not facts. They are conclusions. Conclusions drawn from past experiences, often incomplete, often emotional, often formed at a time when you did not have full awareness. A few failures become, "I'm not good at this." A few rejections become, "I'm not built for that." A few uncomfortable moments become, "This isn't who I am." The mind generalizes quickly because it is trying to protect you from repeated discomfort. But protection and progress rarely move in the same direction. What protects you in one season can limit you in the next. From a deeper perspective, beliefs act like filters. They determine what you notice, what you ignore, and how you interpret everything that happens. Two people can face the same situation and extract completely different meanings from it, simply because their belief systems are different. One sees opportunity, the other sees risk. One sees growth, the other sees threat. The external event is the same. The internal interpretation is not, and interpretation is what drives action. At a more subtle level, every belief you hold carries an energetic signature. It influences your posture, your tone, your decisions, your willingness to engage, your tolerance for discomfort. It shapes the way you move through the world. And over time, that pattern of movement becomes your identity. So changing your life is not about forcing new actions on top of old beliefs. It is about examining the beliefs that make your current actions make sense. Ask yourself, without judgment, without performance, with quiet honesty, what do I believe about effort? What do I believe about failure? What do I believe about people who succeed? What do I believe about myself when things get difficult? Then, observe your behavior. Not what you intend to do, but what you actually do. That is where your real beliefs are revealed. Belief level change does not feel dramatic. There is no explosion, no sudden transformation. It feels subtle, quiet, almost unnoticeable at first. One day, something that used to feel difficult simply feels unnecessary. Not because you forced yourself to change, but because the old behavior no longer fits the new understanding. That is the power of the right idea. It does not push you forward. It removes what was pulling you back. You do not need to become someone else. You need to stop obeying beliefs that no longer reflect who you are capable of becoming. When beliefs shift, identity begins to adjust. When identity adjusts, action follows. Effort becomes less emotional. Consistency becomes less heroic. You stop negotiating with yourself every morning. You stop dramatizing resistance. You simply act in alignment with what now feels true. This is why the most disciplined people do not look tense. They are not fighting themselves. They have resolved the internal conflict. They are not rising to their goals every day. They are falling, calmly and reliably, to beliefs that support those goals. And that is the foundation. Without belief alignment, no system will hold, no habit will last, no routine will sustain. Before discipline, there must be clarity. Before action, there must be alignment. Change the belief, and behavior will follow quietly, consistently, and without force. Chapter 2. The mind does not respond to what sounds good. It responds to what feels true. And that difference is where most people lose control, without realizing it. You can hear an idea that is logical, powerful, even life-changing on the surface, and still fail to act on it. Not because you disagree, but because it does not yet feel real to you. It does not match the internal map your mind has been using to navigate the world. And the mind will always prioritize internal consistency over external accuracy. Familiarity is one of the most powerful forces shaping your perception. When an idea is repeated enough times, especially in emotionally charged environments, it begins to feel natural. And once something feels natural, the mind stops questioning it. It becomes part of the background. It becomes assumed truth. This is how limitations are installed quietly. You hear that success is rare. You hear that stability matters more than risk. You hear that certain paths are not for people like you. You hear that effort should feel hard, that discomfort is a warning, that failure is something to avoid. None of these ideas are necessarily stated as absolute truths. They are implied, modeled, reinforced through observation and repetition. And over time, they become the lens through which you interpret everything. The mind is not built to verify truth constantly. That would require too much energy. Instead, it builds shortcuts, It relies on patterns. It assumes that what has been consistent in the past will remain consistent in the future. This is efficient, but it is also limiting. Because once a pattern is established, the mind begins filtering reality to match it. You no longer see everything. You see what confirms what you already believe. This is why two people can receive the same advice and have completely different outcomes. One hears it and acts. The other hears it, agrees, and does nothing. The difference is not intelligence. It is not discipline. It is whether the idea aligns with what already feels true inside. Advice speaks to behavior, but behavior is governed by belief, and belief is governed by familiarity. If something feels unfamiliar, the mind does not immediately reject it as false. It rejects it as unsafe. It creates hesitation, doubt, overthinking. Not because the idea is wrong, but because it disrupts the existing internal structure. This is why change often feels uncomfortable, even when it is correct. The discomfort is not a sign that you are on the wrong path. It is a sign that you are encountering something that does not match your current internal map. And the mind, in its attempt to protect you, tries to pull you back to what it already understands. From a neurological perspective, this makes sense. The brain strengthens pathways that are used frequently. Thoughts that are repeated become easier to access. Behaviors that are performed regularly become automatic. Emotional responses that are reinforced become default reactions. Over time, these pathways create efficiency. They reduce the need for conscious decision-making. But efficiency comes at a cost. It makes change feel difficult. When you introduce a new idea, you are not just adding information. You are challenging an existing pathway. You are asking the mind to reconsider something it has already categorized as stable. And the mind does not do this easily. It requires repetition. It requires exposure. It requires a level of awareness that most people never sustain long enough. This is why inspiration fades so quickly. Inspiration is often an emotional reaction to a new idea. It feels powerful in the moment because it temporarily overrides the old pattern. But once the emotional intensity drops, the old pathway remains stronger. The system returns to what is familiar, not because you failed, but because the new idea was not reinforced enough to become real. Real change does not happen when you hear something once. It happens when a new idea is seen, examined, repeated, and eventually accepted as more accurate than the old one. This process is quiet. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It feels like a gradual shift in perception, a moment where something that once felt true begins to feel incomplete, a moment where a behavior that once made sense starts to feel unnecessary, a moment where you pause, not because you are forcing yourself to change, but because the old response no longer fits. That is when the rewiring begins. At a deeper level, every idea you accept becomes part of your internal structure. It influences how you interpret effort, resistance, discomfort, and reward. It shapes your expectations, and expectations shape behavior more than motivation ever will. If you expect something to be difficult, you approach it with tension. If you expect something to fail, you hesitate. If you expect yourself to struggle, you create conditions that confirm that expectation. The mind is constantly trying to prove itself right. This is not a flaw. It is a function. The question is not whether your mind is reinforcing patterns. It always is. The question is which patterns it is reinforcing. From a more subtle perspective, your attention acts as the bridge between idea and identity. What you repeatedly focus on gains strength. What you repeatedly interpret becomes meaning, and what becomes meaning shapes your emotional state and your behavior. This is where many people lose awareness. They assume that thoughts are random, that emotions are spontaneous, that reactions are automatic and uncontrollable. But in reality, there is a pattern beneath everything, a structure, a sequence that begins with interpretation. You do not react to reality. You react to what reality means to you, and meaning is learned. If you learned that discomfort means danger, you will avoid it. If you learned that failure defines you, you will fear it. If you learned that effort is exhausting and unrewarding, you will resist it. These interpretations become automatic over time. They feel like instinct, but they are trained responses. And what is trained can be retrained. But retraining does not happen through force. It happens through awareness and repetition. It happens when you begin to notice the gap between what feels true and what is actually useful. It happens when you stop blindly trusting familiarity and start questioning it. Ask yourself, is this belief accurate, or is it just familiar? Is this reaction necessary, or is it just conditioned? Is this hesitation protecting me, or is it limiting me? These questions create space, and space is what allows new ideas to enter without being immediately rejected. From a philosophical perspective, most people do not live in reality. They live in a version of reality, filtered through their past. A version that feels consistent, but not necessarily accurate. And until that filter is examined, change will always feel like an uphill battle. But once the filter begins to shift, everything else follows. You do not need to force yourself to act differently. You need to see differently. Because once you see clearly enough, action becomes a natural extension of understanding. The right idea, repeated with awareness, begins to feel familiar. And once it becomes familiar, the mind stops resisting it. It begins to support it. This is the quiet transformation most people miss. They search for dramatic breakthroughs, sudden shifts, overwhelming motivation. But real change is simpler. It is the gradual replacement of old interpretations with more accurate ones. It is the slow transition from unconscious agreement to conscious choice. You are not trying to become someone new. You are updating the internal logic that determines how you move through the world. And once that logic changes, everything else begins to reorganize around it. Chapter 3. Discipline is not a personality trait. It is not something a few people are born with, while others are left without. It is not a fixed characteristic that determines who succeeds and who struggles. That idea, although widely accepted, is one of the most limiting beliefs a person can carry. Because the moment you believe discipline is part of your personality, you stop questioning everything else. You stop looking at your environment. You stop examining your structure. You stop asking why certain behaviors are easy and others feel impossible. You label yourself, and that label becomes a quiet permission to stay the same. I'm just not disciplined. I've never been consistent. I'm not that type of person. The mind finds comfort in these conclusions because they are simple. They remove complexity. They protect identity. But they also remove responsibility. Not in a freeing way, but in a limiting one. Because if discipline is something you either have or don't have, then effort becomes optional and failure becomes expected. But this is not how the system actually works. Discipline is not personality. It is structure. It is not something you summon in moments of pressure. It is something you design into your environment so that pressure rarely appears. Highly consistent people are not constantly forcing themselves to act. They are operating inside systems that make action the default. They do not rely on willpower. They reduce the need for it. This is what most people misunderstand. They think discipline is about pushing through resistance, about doing things even when they do not feel like it, about becoming stronger, more rigid, more controlled. But willpower is a limited resource. It fluctuates with energy, stress, sleep, and emotional state. If your system depends on willpower, it will eventually fail. Structure does not. Structure is stable. It is repeatable. It answers questions before the mind has a chance to resist. When your environment supports the behavior you want, discipline becomes almost invisible. When it does not, even simple tasks feel heavy. Think about how effortlessly you follow certain patterns every day. You check your phone without thinking. You respond to notifications automatically. You scroll, you switch, you react. That is not a lack of discipline. That is discipline working perfectly in the wrong direction. Your environment is cueing the behavior. The behavior is reinforcing the habit. The habit is shaping your identity. And because it feels automatic, you assume it is who you are. But it is not who you are. It is what you have been trained to do. Identity is not upstream. It is downstream from structure. Change the structure, and behavior begins to shift without negotiation. Most people try to fix discipline at the emotional level. They wait to feel ready. They wait to feel motivated. They wait to feel strong enough to follow through. But discipline does not come from emotion. It comes from friction, or more precisely, from the removal of unnecessary friction. If a behavior requires constant internal debate, the structure is wrong. If a habit depends on your mood, the system is unstable. This is not a moral failure. It is an engineering problem. The disciplined life is not built on intensity. It is built on repeatability. Small actions made inevitable by design. When the path of least resistance leads toward what matters, consistency becomes natural. When it leads away from it, discipline feels like punishment. This is why two people with the same goal can experience completely different realities. One struggles daily, negotiating every step, fighting internal resistance. The other moves steadily, almost quietly, with very little visible effort. Not because one is stronger, but because one removed unnecessary friction. Structure answers questions before they arise. When will I do this? Where will I do it? What happens if I don't feel like it? Without clear answers, the mind fills the gap with delay, distraction, and avoidance. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty increases resistance. The disciplined individual does not trust future motivation. They trust present clarity. They make decisions in advance, when the mind is calm, when emotion is not interfering. They remove choice from the moment where choice would create hesitation. This reduces cognitive load, and when cognitive load drops, follow-through increases. There is a deeper principle at work here. The mind is constantly seeking efficiency. It wants to minimize effort and avoid unnecessary stress. When a behavior is clearly defined and easy to access, the mind accepts it. When it is vague, complex, or requires too much negotiation, the mind resists. From a more subtle perspective, structure shapes not just behavior, but energy. It creates a stable field in which certain actions become more likely and others begin to fade. When your environment is aligned with your intention, your internal state becomes calmer. There is less noise, less internal conflict, more clarity. This is why discipline, when understood correctly, feels freeing, not restrictive. Without structure, every action requires a decision. Every decision requires energy. Every moment becomes a negotiation between what you want to do and what you feel like doing. That constant negotiation is exhausting. Structure removes that burden. You do not debate whether to brush your teeth. You do not negotiate whether to get dressed. These actions happen automatically, not because you are highly disciplined in those areas, but because the structure is already in place. The same principle can be applied to anything else. When people say, "I need more discipline," what they often mean is, "I need a system that does not rely on how I feel." That realization changes everything. It removes shame. It removes self-judgment. It replaces force with clarity. Instead of asking, "Why can't I stick to this?" you begin asking, "What is my environment training me to do instead?" Look at what is easy. Look at what is accessible. Look at what is constantly in your line of sight. That is where your discipline is already being directed. The mind follows the path that has been cleared for it. So if you want to change your behavior, do not start with motivation. Start with design. Remove what pulls you away. Make visible what pulls you forward. Reduce steps. Remove friction. Define the action clearly. Decide in advance. At first, the change will feel small, almost insignificant. There will be no dramatic shift, no surge of emotion, just a quiet alignment between what you intend and what you actually do. But over time, something deeper begins to happen. You start to notice a pattern. You follow through more often. You hesitate less. You act without overthinking. And gradually, the mind begins to update its conclusion. I do this regularly. I follow through. I don't rely on motivation. These are not affirmations. They are observations based on evidence, and that evidence reshapes identity. This is the discipline that lasts. Not rigid, not extreme, not driven by pressure, but built on reliability. And reliability is what rewires the mind. Once you understand that discipline is structural, not personal, you stop waiting to become someone else. You start arranging your world to support who you are becoming. And that shift removes more resistance than motivation ever could. Chapter 4. Your environment is quietly shaping your identity every single day, whether you are aware of it or not. Not in loud, obvious ways, but in subtle repetitions that accumulate over time until they feel like who you are. Most people think identity is something internal, something fixed, something personal. But identity is not created in isolation. It is formed through interaction, through what you see, what you touch, what you return to, what you are surrounded by, consistently enough that it begins to feel normal. What you call yourself is, to a large extent, a reflection of what your environment has trained you to repeat. Look closely at your daily life. What is within reach? What is visible? What is easy? What is constantly interrupting your attention? What is always available without effort? These are not neutral details. They are signals, and your brain is constantly responding to those signals. Every environment is a set of instructions. If your space makes distraction effortless, your attention will fragment. If your space makes comfort immediate, effort will feel unnecessary. If your space surrounds you with stimulation, stillness will feel uncomfortable. Not because something is wrong with you, but because your nervous system has adapted to what it experiences most often. The brain is always learning, always updating, always optimizing based on what it encounters repeatedly. It does not distinguish between what you want and what you expose yourself to. It simply strengthens whatever is used. This is why identity is not upstream from behavior. It is downstream from structure. You are not behaving a certain way because of who you are. You are becoming a certain way because of how you are behaving repeatedly within a given environment. And the most powerful part of this process is that it happens automatically. You do not have to decide to become distracted. If your environment constantly offers distraction, your attention will adapt. You do not have to choose inconsistency. If your environment makes consistency difficult, inconsistency becomes the default. Over time, these patterns accumulate into conclusions. This is just how I am. But that conclusion is based on exposure, not essence. Change the exposure, and the behavior begins to shift. Change the behavior, and the identity begins to update. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They try to change themselves without changing their environment. They rely on internal effort while leaving external triggers untouched. They expect discipline to override design, and when it does not work, they assume the problem is within them. But the problem is rarely internal. It is structural. From a scientific perspective, behavior is driven by cues, responses, and reinforcement. A cue triggers an action. The action produces a result. The result reinforces the loop. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. It requires less and less conscious involvement. Eventually, it becomes part of your identity. From a deeper perspective, your environment is not just physical. It is energetic. It carries patterns of attention, emotion, and expectation. Every space you spend time in holds a certain rhythm, and your nervous system entrains to that rhythm. If your environment is chaotic, your mind becomes reactive. If your environment is noisy, your thoughts become scattered. If your environment is intentional, your actions become more deliberate. This is not abstract. It is observable. You feel different in different spaces, even before anything happens. That is the influence of environment. So the question is not, how do I force myself to change? The question is, what is my environment making easy, and what is it making difficult? Because whatever is easy will be repeated, and whatever is repeated will become identity. Look at the patterns you already follow without thinking, the ones you do consistently without effort. Those are not proof of discipline. They are proof of alignment between your environment and your behavior. This is why redesigning your environment is one of the most powerful forms of self-transformation. It removes the need for constant resistance. It reduces the number of decisions you have to make. It shifts behavior from something you must force into something that happens naturally. When you remove visual clutter, the mind settles. When you reduce unnecessary inputs, attention stabilizes. When you make meaningful actions visible and accessible, they begin to occur more often. At first, the changes may feel small, almost insignificant. Moving an object, removing a distraction, defining a space. But each of these adjustments sends a signal to your brain. This is what matters here. And the brain listens. It begins to reallocate attention. It begins to adjust behavior. It begins to build new patterns, slowly, quietly, without drama. Over time, those patterns accumulate into something deeper. Identity. You start to notice that certain actions feel easier, that you hesitate less, that you engage more naturally with what you once avoided. Not because you became more motivated, but because the environment stopped pulling you in the opposite direction. This is how real change often happens. Not through intensity, but through alignment. You are not fighting yourself anymore. You are supported. From a broader perspective, your environment is a reflection of your current identity, but it is also a blueprint for your future one. What you allow to exist around you reinforces who you are. What you choose to change begins to shape who you are becoming. This creates a feedback loop. Your identity influences your environment. Your environment reinforces your identity. The moment you become aware of this loop, you gain leverage. You can interrupt it. You can redesign it. You can begin to create a space that supports the version of you that you are moving toward, not the version you are trying to leave behind. This does not require perfection. It requires intention. You do not need to control everything. You need to adjust what you interact with, most often, because that is where your identity is being formed. Every object, every signal, every repeated exposure is either reinforcing the past or supporting the future. There is no neutral. So look at your space, not with judgment, but with clarity. Ask yourself, what is this environment training me to do? What version of myself is being reinforced here? Then begin, quietly, to make changes. Not dramatic ones, not overwhelming ones, just precise adjustments that reduce friction and increase alignment. And as those adjustments accumulate, something subtle begins to shift. You stop trying to become someone else. You start living in a way that makes that version of you inevitable. Chapter 5. Most people trust their emotions more than they realize. Not consciously, not deliberately, but in the way they move through their day. If they feel motivated, they act. If they feel resistance, they hesitate. If they feel tired, they delay. If they feel overwhelmed, they stop. It feels natural. It feels intuitive. It even feels wise. But it is also one of the most common ways people lose control of their direction. Because emotions were never meant to be instructions. They were meant to be information. Emotion is a signal, a response generated by your system based on how it interprets what is happening. It is fast, automatic, and often useful, but it is not complete. It does not contain the full context. It does not analyze long-term consequences. It does not evaluate whether the reaction is helpful. It simply reacts. And when that reaction is misunderstood, it becomes authority. This is where the confusion begins. You feel anxious, and instead of recognizing anxiety as a signal of uncertainty, the mind translates it into danger. You feel discomfort, and instead of seeing it as unfamiliarity, the mind interprets it as something being wrong. You feel unmotivated, and instead of recognizing a drop in energy, the mind assumes the task is not worth doing. Without realizing it, emotion moves from observer to commander. I don't feel like it becomes, I shouldn't do it. I feel anxious becomes, this is unsafe. I feel overwhelmed becomes, I can't handle this. These translations happen quickly, quietly, automatically, and over time, they shape behavior in ways that feel justified, but are actually conditioned. This is why inconsistency is not caused by emotion itself. It is caused by obedience to emotion. The presence of emotion is not the problem. The interpretation of it is. The disciplined mind does not eliminate emotion. It changes its role. It listens, but it does not submit. Think about how often your emotions contradict your long-term direction. The urge to avoid effort, the pull toward distraction, the desire for immediate comfort. If these impulses were meant to guide your life, progress would be accidental at best. And yet, many people still wait to feel right before they act. They treat emotional alignment as a prerequisite for movement. They wait for confidence before taking action. They wait for clarity before beginning. They wait for motivation before committing. But action does not follow emotion. Emotion follows action. When you act despite discomfort, the system recalibrates. The nervous system updates its interpretation. What once felt threatening becomes manageable. What once felt overwhelming becomes familiar. The signal changes because the meaning changes. But when you avoid because of discomfort, the opposite happens. The mind learns that the feeling was important enough to stop you. It reinforces the response. It increases sensitivity. The next time the feeling appears, it arrives stronger, faster, more convincing. Avoidance does not reduce emotion. It trains it. This is why emotional regulation is not about suppression. It is about interpretation. A calm, grounded mind does not ask, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" It asks, "What is this feeling indicating, and does it deserve control over my action?" That question creates space, and space changes everything. When there is space between what you feel and what you do, choice returns. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are responding deliberately. You can feel anxious and still move forward. You can feel tired and still begin. You can feel uncertain and still act. This is not emotional numbness. It is emotional clarity. It is the ability to experience internal states without being defined by them. There is a critical distinction here that most people overlook. "I am anxious" is very different from "anxiety is present." The first creates identity. The second creates observation. When you identify with emotion, you merge with it. It becomes part of who you are. It shapes your decisions without resistance. But when you observe emotion, you create distance. And in that distance, there is evaluation. Emotion becomes data, and data can be interpreted. This is where real control begins. Not by controlling what you feel, but by deciding what role that feeling plays in your behavior. From a neurological perspective, emotion activates quickly, faster than logic. It is designed to prepare you for action, not to decide the best course of action. That responsibility belongs to a different part of the brain, one that requires a moment of pause to engage. If you act immediately on emotion, that deeper processing never happens. But if you pause, even briefly, you allow a different system to come online, one that can evaluate, compare, and choose. This is why the strongest individuals are not the ones who feel the least. They are the ones who react the least. They experience emotion fully, but they do not rush to obey it. They do not build their lives around how they feel. They build them around what matters. And that difference creates stability. From a more subtle perspective, emotions are waves of energy moving through your system. They rise, peak, and fall. But when you attach to them, when you interpret them as truth, you extend their lifespan. You amplify them. You give them continuity. When you observe without attachment, they pass more quickly. This is not theory. It is experience. Think about a moment when you felt intense discomfort, but continued anyway. Over time, the intensity decreased, not because the situation changed, but because your relationship to the feeling changed. The system adapted. This is how resilience is built. Not by eliminating difficult emotions, but by reducing their influence over your direction. Each time you act without emotional permission, you send a new signal. This feeling does not control the outcome. And the system learns. It begins to lower the intensity. It begins to stop escalating signals that no longer produce the same response. It begins to trust that you are not going to react automatically. Over time, emotional noise decreases. Clarity increases. You move with less urgency, less reactivity, less internal conflict. You stop trying to feel perfect before you act. You act and allow your emotional state to adjust afterward. This shift is subtle but powerful, because once emotion is reclassified as information rather than instruction, a significant amount of internal resistance disappears. You are no longer waiting for the right feeling. You are responding to what is real. And in that space, consistency becomes possible. Not because you forced yourself to be different, but because you are no longer being directed by something that was never meant to lead. Chapter 6. Avoidance feels like relief in the moment, but it quietly builds the very thing you are trying to escape. When you step back from discomfort, when you delay action because something feels uncertain, heavy, or unfamiliar, there is an immediate sense of ease. The pressure drops. The tension softens. The mind interprets that relief as a correct decision. But the system is learning something deeper. It is learning that this feeling stopped you, and once that association is made, the feeling becomes stronger the next time it appears. This is how fear is trained, not through the intensity of the experience itself, but through the response that follows it. The brain is designed to detect patterns quickly. It does not wait for multiple confirmations when it comes to perceived threat. A single moment of avoidance can be enough to establish a rule. This sensation leads to retreat, and once that rule exists, the system begins to protect it. The next time discomfort appears, it arrives faster, more convincing, more urgent. Not because the situation is more dangerous, but because the brain is trying to ensure consistency with what it has already learned. This is why avoidance does not reduce fear. It reinforces it. Every time you step back, the nervous system updates its prediction. It increases the signal. It amplifies the response. It prepares you more aggressively the next time. From the inside, it feels like the fear is growing. But in reality, it is being practiced. This is the part most people misunderstand. They believe that if something feels overwhelming, the correct response is to reduce exposure, to wait, to prepare more, to avoid until they feel ready. But readiness does not come from waiting. It comes from engagement. The nervous system does not recalibrate through thought alone. It recalibrates through experience. When you act in the presence of discomfort, something important happens. The brain receives new information. This feeling did not lead to harm. This situation did not require retreat. This action was possible, even with uncertainty present. That information begins to update the internal model. Slowly at first, subtly, but consistently. The next time the same feeling appears, it is slightly weaker, slightly less urgent, slightly easier to move through. Not because you became stronger in a dramatic sense, but because the system is learning that the signal does not require the same level of response. This is how fear is reduced, not by eliminating it, but by changing what it means. Avoidance teaches the brain that discomfort is a boundary. Action teaches the brain that discomfort is a threshold. One leads to contraction. The other leads to expansion. From a physiological perspective, the nervous system is constantly adjusting based on feedback. It predicts outcomes based on past experience. If the prediction is confirmed, it strengthens. If the prediction is contradicted, it begins to adjust. Avoidance confirms the prediction. Action contradicts it. This is why small, consistent exposure is more powerful than intense, occasional effort. The system does not need overwhelming proof. It needs repeated evidence. Each time you act despite hesitation, you send a signal that refines the model. Each time you stay present instead of retreating, you reduce the need for escalation. Each time you move forward without emotional certainty, you expand what feels possible. This is not about forcing yourself into extreme discomfort. It is about refusing to let temporary states define your direction. There is a difference. One creates pressure. The other creates clarity. You are not trying to prove something to yourself. You are updating the system through experience. From a deeper perspective, avoidance fragments your relationship with yourself. Each time you step back from what you know matters, you create a small break in trust. The mind begins to expect inconsistency. It begins to assume that discomfort will lead to retreat. Over time, that expectation becomes identity. I don't follow through. I avoid things when they get difficult. This is just how I am. But these are not fixed truths. They are conclusions based on repeated patterns. Change the pattern, and the conclusion begins to change. This is where consistency becomes more important than intensity. You do not need to eliminate fear in a single moment. You need to interact with it differently, repeatedly, until the system updates. At first, it will feel unnatural. The urge to retreat will still be there. The discomfort will still appear. The mind will still generate reasons to delay. That is not failure. That is the old pattern still active. What matters is what you do next. Do you follow the pattern, or do you interrupt it? Each interruption is a signal. Each signal is a form of retraining. From a more subtle perspective, every time you move forward, despite internal resistance, you are shifting your energetic posture. You are no longer collapsing in the presence of uncertainty. You are standing within it, and that shift changes how you experience not just the situation, but yourself. You begin to see that the feeling is not as powerful as it seemed, that it rises, peaks, and falls, that it does not define your capacity to act. And with that realization, something important happens. The fear loses authority. It may still appear. It may still be felt, but it no longer dictates direction. This is the foundation of resilience, not the absence of discomfort, but the ability to move through it without being controlled by it. Over time, the system adapts. The intensity decreases. The recovery becomes faster. The hesitation becomes shorter. The action becomes more natural. And eventually, something shifts. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once triggered avoidance becomes part of your normal range of experience. This is not because the world became easier. It is because your interpretation changed. The nervous system learned a new rule. This does not stop me. That rule, repeated enough times, becomes part of your identity. You are no longer someone who avoids. You are someone who engages. Not perfectly, not without resistance, but consistently enough that the system begins to trust the new pattern. And once that trust is established, the need for fear to escalate begins to disappear, because the mind no longer needs to protect you from something you have already proven you can handle. This is how you retrain the system, not through force, not through suppression, but through calm, repeated contradiction of the old pattern, one action at a time. Chapter 7. Consistency is not just about getting things done. It is about rewriting who you believe you are. Most people think identity comes first. They say things like, "I'm not disciplined. I'm not confident. I've never been consistent." And they treat these statements as fixed descriptions, as if they are observing something permanent. But identity does not create behavior. Behavior creates identity. You do not act a certain way because of who you are. You believe you are a certain way because of how you have acted repeatedly. The mind is always collecting evidence, quietly, constantly, without judgment. It watches what you do, not what you intend to do. It records patterns, not promises. And over time, it forms conclusions. This is who you are. That conclusion is not based on a single moment. It is based on repetition. This is why affirmations often feel empty. You can repeat words that describe the person you want to become, but if your actions do not support them, the mind does not accept them. It recognizes the inconsistency. It rejects the statement, not because it is negative, but because it is unsupported. The brain does not update identity through intention. It updates identity through evidence. And the most reliable way to generate that evidence is consistency. Not intensity, not motivation, not short bursts of effort followed by long periods of inaction, but small, repeatable actions performed often enough that they become predictable. Each time you follow through, you cast a vote. I show up. I complete what I start. I act even when it is uncomfortable. One action does not define you, but repeated actions begin to shift the internal narrative. At first, the change is subtle. You may not notice it. The mind still holds on to the old identity because the new evidence is not yet strong enough. It treats your efforts as exceptions. That was just a good day. That was temporary. That is not who you are. And this is where most people stop. They become discouraged because the identity has not changed yet. They expect a shift in how they feel before continuing. They wait for confidence, for certainty, for a sense that the new behavior is natural. But identity does not update before behavior. It updates after. The brain is conservative. It does not change its conclusions quickly. It waits for proof. It watches for consistency. It looks for patterns that repeat without emotional reinforcement. Only then does it begin to adjust. This is why short bursts of effort rarely lead to lasting change. They do not provide enough data. They do not override the existing pattern. They are treated as anomalies, not as a new standard. But when action becomes consistent, something shifts. The mind stops questioning whether this is temporary. It begins to assume it is stable. And when that assumption forms, resistance decreases. Not because the task itself became easier, but because the behavior no longer threatens identity. The brain protects identity. If your internal narrative says, "I am not someone who does this," every attempt to act differently will feel heavy. It will create friction. It will generate resistance. But once identity begins to update, the same action feels different. It feels aligned. You are no longer forcing yourself to do something unfamiliar. You are expressing something that feels increasingly accurate. This is the hidden power of consistency. It is not about discipline in the traditional sense. It is about identity negotiation. Each action is a signal. Each repetition is a reinforcement. Over time, the signals accumulate into a pattern, and the pattern becomes a belief. This is what I do. This is who I am. From a neurological perspective, this process is gradual by design. The brain avoids rapid identity shifts because they create instability. It prefers slow, steady accumulation of evidence. This makes the change more durable. From a deeper perspective, consistency creates rhythm, and rhythm stabilizes the system. When your actions follow a predictable pattern, the mind relaxes. It no longer needs to evaluate each decision. It no longer needs to question your reliability. It begins to trust the pattern. That trust reduces internal resistance. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop overthinking simple actions. You stop creating unnecessary tension around things that have already been decided. This is why consistency feels calm, not dramatic. There is no surge of emotion, no moment of transformation. Just a quiet shift in how you move through your day. You show up. You follow through. You repeat. And over time, the identity begins to change. Not because you declared it, but because the evidence became undeniable. you start to notice that skipping the behavior feels different. It feels off. It feels inconsistent with how you have been acting. That discomfort is not pressure. It is alignment. The identity is beginning to protect the new pattern. This is the turning point most people never reach. They stop too early. They quit while the identity is still undecided, while the mind is still evaluating, while the new pattern has not yet become familiar. They interpret the lack of immediate change as failure, when in reality, it is part of the process. Identity does not shift when you feel ready. It shifts when you remain consistent long enough that the mind has no choice but to update. This is why the goal of consistency is not maximum effort. It is minimum friction. A behavior that is small enough to repeat will always outperform one that is impressive but unsustainable. 5 minutes a day, done consistently, creates more identity change than a single week of intense effort, followed by nothing. The mind does not need intensity. It needs reliability. From a broader perspective, consistency is not about proving something to the world. It is about signaling something to yourself. You are teaching your mind what to expect from you. And once that expectation stabilizes, effort decreases. You no longer need reminders. You no longer need motivation. You no longer need to convince yourself to act. You act because it is what you do. This is where identity stops being aspirational and becomes functional. You are no longer trying to become someone. You are becoming that person through what you repeatedly do. And that process, although quiet, is one of the most powerful forms of transformation available to you. Chapter 8. Most people overestimate the power of intensity and underestimate the power of repetition. They believe change requires a surge, a moment of force, a dramatic shift where everything feels different all at once. They wait for that moment. They chase it, and when it fades, as it always does, they assume something went wrong. But the system does not change through intensity. It changes through consistency. Intensity creates emotion. It creates movement for a short period of time. It can initiate action, but it does not stabilize it. The nervous system cannot maintain high levels of intensity without exhaustion. And once exhaustion appears, the pattern collapses. Repetition, on the other hand, does something entirely different. It builds familiarity. And familiarity is what the mind trusts. The brain is not looking for extraordinary proof. It is looking for reliable signals. It is constantly asking one quiet question. Is this what we do now? Not once, not occasionally, but repeatedly. When the answer becomes consistent, the system begins to adjust. This is why small actions, performed regularly, carry more power than large actions performed occasionally. They create a steady stream of evidence. They remove uncertainty. They signal stability. From a neurological perspective, repetition strengthens pathways. Each time a behavior is performed, the connection becomes easier to access. The signal becomes clearer. The response becomes faster. Over time, the behavior moves from conscious effort to automatic pattern. But there is something deeper happening as well. Repetition creates rhythm, and rhythm regulates the system. Your body is already governed by rhythm. Your breath follows a pattern. Your heart follows a pattern. Your sleep cycles follow a pattern. Stability comes from repetition, not from intensity. When your actions align with a steady rhythm, your nervous system begins to settle. It no longer experiences constant fluctuation between effort and collapse. It finds a baseline, and within that baseline, consistency becomes sustainable. This is why extreme effort often fails. It disrupts rhythm. It creates a spike, followed by a drop, And the drop reinforces the idea that you are inconsistent, that you cannot maintain change, that your effort is unreliable. But when the action is small, repeatable, and consistent, the pattern stabilizes. The mind begins to expect it, and expectation changes everything. When the brain expects a behavior, it prepares for it. It allocates energy. It reduces resistance. It removes friction. The action no longer feels like a decision. It feels like a continuation. This is the shift most people miss. They focus on how much they can do instead of how often they can repeat. They measure progress by intensity instead of reliability. And in doing so, they create cycles instead of patterns. From a deeper perspective, repetition does not just change behavior. It changes identity. Each repeated action sends a message. This is not temporary. This is not random. This is who we are becoming. And when that message is sent consistently enough, the mind accepts it. Identity updates quietly. You do not feel a dramatic change. You do not wake up one day as a completely different person. Instead, you notice something subtle. The action feels normal. You no longer question it. You no longer resist it. You no longer need to think about it. It simply happens. That is the moment repetition has done its work. The behavior has become part of your baseline. From a psychological standpoint, this is where trust is built. Not trust in the external world, but trust in yourself. You begin to see that you follow through, that you show up, that your actions are predictable, and that predictability creates stability. When the mind trusts you, it stops resisting you. It no longer generates doubt, hesitation, or internal conflict around the behavior. It allows the pattern to continue without interference. This is why consistency reduces effort over time. At the beginning, action may feel difficult. It may require attention. It may require conscious effort. But as repetition continues, the cost decreases. Not because the task changed, but because the system adapted. From a more subtle perspective, repetition aligns your internal state. When your actions are inconsistent, your energy becomes fragmented. You start and stop. You move forward and pull back. You create internal contradiction. That contradiction generates noise. But when your actions follow a steady rhythm, the noise decreases. There is less internal debate, less hesitation, less conflict. You move with continuity, and continuity creates momentum. Momentum is not speed. It is direction maintained over time. This is what allows progress to compound. Small actions, repeated consistently, create a trajectory. And that trajectory becomes visible over time. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. This is why patience is essential. The system does not respond to urgency. It responds to consistency. You cannot rush identity change. You cannot accelerate neural adaptation beyond a certain point. The process requires repetition. It requires time. It requires stability. But once the pattern is established, it becomes self-sustaining. You no longer rely on external pressure. You no longer need constant reminders. The behavior continues because it fits. From a broader perspective, this reflects a fundamental principle of life. Growth is not explosive. It is cumulative. Seeds do not become trees overnight. They grow through repeated cycles. Light, water, time, consistency. The same principle applies to you. You are not transformed by a single moment. You are shaped by what you repeat. So instead of asking, "How much can I do today?" ask, "What can I repeat tomorrow?" Instead of chasing intensity, build rhythm. Instead of forcing change, allow it to accumulate. Because the mind does not change when you push it. It changes when you show it, again and again, what is now true. And once it accepts that truth, it no longer needs to resist. It simply follows. Chapter 9. Focus is not something you either have or don't have. It is not a rare ability reserved for a few highly disciplined individuals. It is a decision that is either supported or sabotaged by your environment. Most people believe they have a problem with attention. They describe themselves as easily distracted, unable to concentrate, constantly pulled in different directions. They assume their mind is wired that way. But the mind is not randomly scattered. It is trained. Every time you check your phone in the middle of a task, every time you switch tabs, every time you respond to a notification, you reinforce a simple rule. Relief is always available, and once that rule is installed, the nervous system begins to expect it. Stillness becomes uncomfortable. Depth feels slow. Focus feels unnatural. Not because you lack the ability, but because your system has adapted to constant stimulation. This is the hidden cost of distraction. It is not just lost time. It is a rewiring of attention. Focus becomes difficult not because it is inherently hard, but because distraction has been made too easy, and the mind always moves toward what is easiest. This is where most people make another mistake. They try to force focus. They push themselves to concentrate harder. They fight their attention. They blame themselves when their mind drifts. But attention does not respond well to force. It responds to environment. What you allow around you shapes what your mind considers important. If interruptions are constant, attention fragments. If stimulation is always available, depth feels boring. If novelty is rewarded, sustained effort feels unnecessary. None of this is a flaw in your character. It is a result of conditioning. From a neurological perspective, every shift in attention carries a cost. Each time you switch tasks, the brain must disengage from one context and re-engage with another. This process consumes energy. It reduces clarity. It weakens the depth of your thinking. Over time, frequent switching trains the brain to operate at a shallow level. You become responsive instead of intentional. Busy, but not focused. Active, but not directed. This is why many people feel mentally exhausted, even when they have not done anything deeply demanding. Their attention has been fragmented, and fragmentation creates fatigue. Focus returns when fragmentation is reduced. Not through effort, but through subtraction. The disciplined thinker does not ask, "How do I concentrate harder?" They ask, "What is pulling my attention away, and why is it allowed?" This shifts the problem. It is no longer about forcing the mind. It is about designing the environment. Focus is what remains when unnecessary options disappear. When there is nothing else to respond to, the mind settles naturally into what is in front of it. This is why highly focused individuals often appear calm. They are not gripping their attention. They have simply removed competing signals. They have reduced noise. They have closed exits. From a deeper perspective, your attention is one of your most valuable resources. Where you place it determines what grows in your life. Attention is not neutral. It carries energy. Whatever you repeatedly focus on gains strength. It becomes more familiar, more significant, more influential, and over time, it shapes your perception, your behavior, and your identity. So when your attention is constantly pulled in different directions, your energy becomes scattered. You lose depth, you lose clarity, you lose continuity. But when your attention is protected, something shifts. Thoughts slow down. Decisions become clearer. Actions become more deliberate. You begin to move with intention instead of reaction. This is where real focus begins. not as an act of force, but as a result of design. From a practical standpoint, this means reducing the number of inputs competing for your attention. Fewer notifications, fewer open loops, fewer unnecessary stimuli. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind, used to constant engagement, will seek distraction. It will generate restlessness. It will look for something to respond to. That discomfort is not a problem. It is a recalibration. The nervous system is adjusting to a different rhythm. If you stay with that discomfort, without reacting, something begins to change. The urge to escape weakens. The need for constant stimulation decreases. Attention stabilizes. Focus emerges. Not because you forced it, but because you allowed it. This is why deep work is not just a productivity technique. It is a state that cannot exist alongside constant interruption. You do not need to focus all day. You need protected periods of focus, clear boundaries, defined time. A space where attention is not being pulled in multiple directions. When focus is treated as a decision, something you choose by what you allow and what you remove, it becomes reliable. You stop saying, "I can't focus," and start noticing, "I've been allowing too many exits." And once those exits are closed, attention stays. This does not make you rigid. It makes you deliberate. You choose when to engage deeply. You choose when to disengage fully. You are no longer reacting to every signal. You are directing your energy. And when your energy is directed, momentum returns. Because momentum is not created by speed. It is created by continuity. Staying with one thing long enough for it to develop, for it to deepen, for it to compound. That is where real progress happens. And that is only possible when focus is not forced, but protected. Chapter 10. Remove the exits, and the mind settles. Most people don't struggle with focus because they lack ability. They struggle because they have too many ways to escape. Every notification, every open tab, every small distraction is an exit. A doorway out of effort, out of discomfort, out of depth. And the mind, trained to conserve energy and seek immediate relief, will always notice those exits. It doesn't matter how strong your intention is. If escape is available, attention will drift. Not because you are weak, but because the system is efficient. This is why focus is not about adding more control. It is about removing unnecessary options. Focus is what remains when there is nothing else competing for your attention. When the exits are open, your mind stays partially engaged. It never fully commits. It remains alert to alternatives, ready to leave at any moment. This creates a state of divided attention. You are present, but not fully. Engaged, but not deeply. Working, but not progressing. From the outside, it looks like effort. From the inside, it feels like friction. And over time, this fragmented state becomes familiar. You begin to believe this is how your mind works. But it is not your mind. It is your environment. Every exit you allow sends a message. This is not important enough to stay with. And the brain listens. It begins to lower the priority of the task. It reduces engagement. It weakens the connection between attention and effort. This is the hidden cost of constant escape. It is not just interruption. It is devaluation. The more you leave, the less meaningful the task feels. The less meaningful it feels, the easier it is to leave again. This creates a loop, and that loop erodes focus over time. To reverse this, you do not need to increase discipline. You need to reduce exits. From a practical level, this means creating conditions where there is nothing else to respond to. One task, one window, one direction. When alternatives are removed, The mind has fewer decisions to make. It stops scanning for options. It begins to settle. At first, this stillness may feel uncomfortable. The mind, used to constant movement, will resist. It will generate thoughts. It will seek stimulation. It will create the urge to check, to switch, to leave. This is not failure. This is withdrawal from distraction. The nervous system is adjusting to a new baseline. If you stay with it, without reacting, something shifts. The urgency fades. The restlessness decreases. The mind begins to stabilize. And in that stability, focus appears. Not forced, not strained, but natural. From a neurological perspective, the brain requires uninterrupted time to enter deeper states of processing. These states are where complex thinking happens, where ideas connect, where clarity forms. But these states cannot exist if attention is constantly interrupted. Each interruption resets the process. Each exit pulls you back to the surface. So if you never remove the exits, you never reach depth. You remain at the level of reaction. From a deeper perspective, stillness is not empty. It is full. It is where insight emerges. It is where understanding deepens. It is where the noise fades and something clearer becomes visible. But most people never reach this state because they leave too early. They interpret the initial discomfort as a sign that something is wrong. They mistake restlessness for inability. But restlessness is part of the transition. It is the system recalibrating. If you stay long enough, the experience changes. What once felt uncomfortable begins to feel steady. What once felt slow begins to feel precise. What once felt empty begins to feel focused. This is the shift from fragmented attention to directed awareness. And it only happens when the exits are closed. From a behavioral perspective, removing exits simplifies everything. You no longer need to decide whether to stay or leave. The decision has already been made. This reduces mental load. It reduces friction. It allows attention to settle without resistance. You are not constantly choosing to focus. You are simply not choosing to leave. This distinction matters because focus is not built through repeated acts of force. It is built through the absence of escape. From a broader perspective, the ability to stay is becoming rare. The world is designed to pull you away, to fragment your attention, to reward quick reactions over deep engagement. But depth is where value is created. Depth is where skill develops. Depth is where understanding compounds. And depth requires time. Uninterrupted time. Protected time. So instead of asking how to focus more, ask, what am I allowing that is breaking my focus? What exits are always available? What distractions have become normalized? Then begin to remove them. Not all at once. Not perfectly, but intentionally. Close one exit, then another. Reduce the number of ways your attention can leave. And as you do, something changes. You begin to experience a different quality of thought. Less scattered, more stable, more connected. You stay longer. You go deeper. And over time, that depth becomes familiar. It becomes part of how you work, part of how you think, part of who you are. This is the quiet transformation of attention, not through effort, but through design. You are not forcing focus. You are creating the conditions where focus becomes inevitable. And once those conditions are in place, the mind no longer needs to be controlled. It simply settles into what remains. Chapter 11. Most people wait for motivation before they act. They believe that once they feel inspired, energized, or emotionally ready, movement will follow naturally. But motivation is unstable. It rises and falls with sleep, stress, environment, and mood. It is not a reliable foundation for consistent action. clarity is. Clarity does something motivation cannot. It removes hesitation. When the mind knows exactly what to do next, it does not need to debate. It does not need to negotiate. It does not need to generate emotional energy to begin. It simply moves. This is why people who rely on motivation often feel stuck, while people who rely on clarity move steadily, even without feeling particularly driven. Motivation tries to push you forward. Clarity removes what is in the way. Most hesitation is not laziness. It is confusion. When a task is unclear, the mind resists it, not because it is difficult, but because it is undefined. It requires too many decisions, too much interpretation, too much mental effort before action can even begin. I'll start later. I need to think about this more. I'm not sure what the right move is. These are not excuses. They are signals. Signals that the next step is not clear. The brain avoids unclear tasks because uncertainty requires energy. It creates cognitive load. It forces the mind to evaluate possibilities, predict outcomes, and manage ambiguity. Clarity removes that cost. It answers the question before the mind has to ask it. What exactly needs to be done? Where does it happen? When does it start? How long does it take? When these questions are answered, action becomes simple. Not easy, but simple. And simplicity increases follow-through. The disciplined thinker does not ask, "What do I feel like doing today?" They ask, "What is the next concrete step?" Not the entire plan, not the final outcome, just the next action. This reduces resistance, because the mind does not need to process everything at once. It only needs to engage with what is directly in front of it. From a neurological perspective, decision-making consumes energy. Each unresolved question adds to the load. Each option creates friction. When too many decisions are required, the system slows down. Clarity reduces the number of decisions. It creates a path. And when the path is clear, the mind follows it. This is why many people feel tired before they even begin. They are not exhausted from action. They are exhausted from thinking, from trying to decide, from navigating uncertainty. Clarity removes that burden. It tells the system, this is settled. And once something is settled, execution becomes mechanical. You no longer need to convince yourself. You no longer need to wait for the right feeling. You act because the decision has already been made. This is how professionals operate. They do not rely on how they feel. They rely on what has been decided. They remove choice from the moment where choice creates delay. This is not rigidity. It is efficiency. From a deeper perspective, clarity creates internal quiet. When you are unclear, the mind generates noise, doubt, questions, alternatives, distractions. This noise fragments attention. It drains energy. It weakens focus. But when you are clear, the noise disappears. There is no internal argument, no back and forth, just direction. And direction creates movement. Clarity does not mean you know everything. It means you know enough to act. You may not know how the entire process will unfold. You do not need to. You only need to know what comes next. This shift is powerful because it changes the nature of action. Action stops being emotional. It becomes procedural. You are no longer asking, "Do I feel like it?" You are executing what has already been defined. And when action becomes procedural, consistency increases, because it no longer depends on fluctuating internal states. From a broader perspective, clarity is a form of stability. It anchors your attention. It reduces variability. It creates a sense of control. Not control over outcomes, but control over direction. And direction is what matters. Motivation creates spikes. Clarity creates momentum. Spikes feel powerful, but they fade. Momentum builds slowly, but it sustains. And sustained movement is what leads to change. Over time, clarity begins to shape identity. You become someone who moves without hesitation. Someone who does not wait for the perfect moment. Someone who acts based on what is defined, not what is felt. This builds a different kind of confidence. Not emotional confidence. Procedural confidence. You trust yourself because you follow through. Not because you feel strong, but because you act consistently. This trust compounds. It reduces internal resistance. It stabilizes behavior. It reinforces identity. And all of it begins with something simple: knowing what to do next. So instead of asking how to feel more motivated, ask, what decision can I make right now that removes friction? What step can I define clearly enough that action becomes obvious? Because once clarity is in place, motivation becomes unnecessary. You do not need to push yourself forward. You simply remove what was holding you back. And movement happens naturally. Chapter 12. Confusion is more exhausting than effort. Most people assume they are tired because of how much they have to do. But often, the real fatigue comes before the action even begins. It comes from thinking without direction, from holding too many possibilities at once, from trying to decide what matters without a clear framework. The mind is not designed to operate efficiently in constant uncertainty. When everything is vague, everything requires evaluation. Every task becomes a question. Every decision becomes a negotiation. And that process consumes energy. You feel it as hesitation, as delay, as resistance. But underneath, it is cognitive overload. The brain is trying to process too much without enough structure. This is why clarity restores power. Because clarity simplifies. It reduces the number of variables the mind has to manage. It narrows focus. It defines direction. And when direction is defined, the system relaxes. Not because the work disappears, but because the uncertainty does. From a neurological standpoint, the brain is always trying to conserve energy. It prefers predictable patterns over open-ended problems. When faced with ambiguity, it slows down. It hesitates. It seeks easier alternatives. This is not avoidance. It is efficiency. But when ambiguity becomes constant, efficiency turns into stagnation. You stop moving. Not because you cannot act, but because the system is overwhelmed by the need to decide. This is where precision becomes essential. Precision is not about perfection. It is about definition. It is about turning something unclear into something actionable. Instead of work on the project, it becomes open the file and complete the first section. Instead of get healthier, it becomes walk for 10 minutes. Instead of be more productive, it becomes focus on this task for the next 30 minutes. The smaller and clearer the action, the easier it is for the brain to engage. Because the cost of starting is reduced. This is the shift most people need. Not more effort, more precision. When the next step is clearly defined, the mind does not need to interpret. It does not need to plan. It does not need to debate. It executes. And execution builds momentum. From a deeper perspective, confusion creates noise. Not just mental noise, but emotional noise. Doubt, second-guessing, overthinking. This noise fragments attention. It pulls you in multiple directions. It weakens your sense of control. You begin to feel scattered, uncertain, disconnected from your own direction. But precision creates quiet. When you know what to do, the noise fades. There is no need to question. No need to compare. No need to evaluate endlessly. You act, and in action, clarity increases further. This creates a reinforcing loop. Clarity leads to action. Action leads to more clarity. The system stabilizes. From a philosophical perspective, most people are not stuck because they lack ability. They are stuck because they lack definition. They are trying to move without a clear path, trying to act without a clear step, trying to decide without a clear framework. And the mind resists that. It prefers certainty over possibility, even if the certainty is limiting. This is why many people remain in familiar patterns, not because those patterns are better, but because they are defined. They know what to expect. They know how to operate within them. Change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty requires energy. But when change is broken down into precise steps, the uncertainty decreases. The system begins to accept it. From a practical standpoint, this means reducing the scope of your thinking. Instead of focusing on everything that needs to be done, focus on what needs to be done next. Not later, not eventually. Now. This is where control exists, not in the entire future, but in the immediate step. From a more subtle perspective, precision creates alignment between intention and action. When your intention is vague, your actions are inconsistent. When your intention is precise, your actions follow. This alignment reduces internal conflict. You are no longer pulled between what you want and what you do. They begin to match, and that match creates stability. Over time, this stability builds confidence. Not emotional confidence, not the kind that depends on feeling good, but procedural confidence. You trust yourself because you act, because you follow through, because your actions are consistent with your decisions. This trust is quiet. It does not need validation. It does not need reinforcement. It simply exists, and it strengthens with each repetition. From a broader perspective, precision is a form of respect. Respect for your time, respect for your energy, respect for your direction. It acknowledges that your attention is valuable, that your effort should not be wasted on confusion, that your movement should not be slowed by unnecessary complexity. So, instead of asking, "Why can't I get started?" ask, "What is unclear?" Because once the uncertainty is removed, the resistance often disappears with it. The system does not need to be pushed. It needs to be guided, clearly. And once that guidance is in place, action becomes natural. Not because it is easy, but because it is defined. Chapter 13. Your life is not shaped by what you say you value. It is shaped by what you tolerate repeatedly. This is one of the most overlooked forces in personal change. Not because it is complex, but because it is quiet. It does not demand attention. It does not announce itself. It operates in the background, shaping your standards one small allowance at a time. Most people believe their standards are defined by their goals, their intentions, or their ideals. But that is not what the mind uses as a reference. The mind uses behavior, specifically what you allow to continue without resistance. Every time you accept something that you know is not aligned with your direction, the brain records it, not as a mistake, as a standard. This is acceptable. This is normal. This is what we do. And over time, these quiet permissions accumulate, not into one dramatic failure, but into gradual drift. Drift away from clarity. Drift away from intention. Drift away from the version of yourself you are trying to become. This is how standards erode. Not through collapse, through compromise. It rarely happens all at once. It happens in small moments. I'll skip this today. It doesn't matter this time. I'll fix it later. Each of these decisions feels harmless in isolation, but the mind does not interpret them that way. It interprets patterns, and patterns become identity. If you tolerate inconsistency, inconsistency becomes normal. If you tolerate distraction, focus weakens. If you tolerate self-neglect, self-respect erodes. This is not punishment. It is conditioning. The brain is constantly learning what to expect from you, and what you repeat becomes the expectation. This is why many people feel stuck without knowing why. Nothing dramatic has gone wrong. They simply adjusted their standards downward over time. And once the standard lowers, behavior follows. From a psychological perspective, standards operate differently than goals. Goals are optional. Standards are enforced. A goal says, I want this. A standard says, this is not acceptable. One negotiates. The other defines boundaries. This distinction matters, because negotiation creates flexibility, but also inconsistency. Boundaries create clarity. When a standard is clear, behavior simplifies. There is no debate, no emotional argument, no need to decide in the moment. The decision has already been made. From a deeper perspective, standards act as filters. They determine what enters your life and what does not, what behaviors are allowed, what patterns are repeated, what version of yourself is reinforced. They are not loud. They do not require constant attention, but they shape everything, because they operate automatically. You do not wake up and decide whether to follow a true standard. You follow it because it is part of your identity. This is why grounded individuals appear calm. They are not constantly making decisions. They have already decided what is acceptable, and that decision removes a significant amount of internal conflict. From a more subtle perspective, standards define your energetic boundaries. What you tolerate becomes part of your environment, and your environment, as you have seen, shapes your behavior. This creates a loop. You tolerate something. It becomes normal. It reinforces identity. Identity influences future tolerance. Breaking this loop requires awareness. It requires honesty. Not harshness, not perfection. Honesty. What are you allowing that you know is costing you clarity? Where are you making exceptions that are becoming patterns? Where are you lowering your standards to avoid discomfort? These questions are not meant to create pressure. They are meant to reveal alignment. Because raising standards is not about becoming strict. It is about becoming clear. Clear about what you are willing to repeat. Clear about what you are willing to accept. Clear about what no longer fits the direction you are moving in. From a practical standpoint, you do not need many standards. You need a few that matter. A few that define your baseline. A few that you enforce consistently, because each enforced standard removes an entire category of decisions. You no longer ask, do I feel like it? You ask, is this aligned? And that question simplifies everything. From a behavioral perspective, the cost of low standards is not immediate failure. It is slow drift. Drift that feels harmless. Drift that is easy to ignore. Drift that accumulates over time until you no longer recognize where you started. This is why standards must be intentional, not reactive, not based on mood, but based on clarity. From a broader perspective, your standards are teaching your brain what kind of life you accept. Every repeated allowance becomes part of your reality. Every enforced boundary becomes part of your identity. So if you want to change your life, do not start with massive action. Start with small, clear standards, things that you do not negotiate, things that define your baseline, things that you repeat consistently enough that the mind begins to trust them. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. You may notice the gap between what you say you want and what you are actually allowing. That discomfort is not a problem. It is awareness. And awareness is the first step in recalibration. Over time, as standards rise, behavior follows. Not because you force it, but because inconsistency begins to feel out of place. You no longer feel right breaking your own boundaries. Not out of guilt, out of alignment. This is the shift. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop making exceptions that cost you momentum. You stop allowing patterns that contradict your direction. And in that space, something stabilizes. Your actions begin to match your values. Your behavior begins to reflect your intentions. Your identity begins to align with your standards. And that alignment creates a different kind of life. Not louder, not more intense, but more stable, more clear, more consistent. Because you are no longer living by what you want occasionally. You are living by what you accept consistently. Conclusion. Your life does not change when you want it to. It changes when your internal structure changes. Everything you've heard is not a collection of techniques, but a shift in how you see. Beliefs shape behavior. Structure shapes discipline. Emotion informs, but does not decide. Consistency builds identity. Focus is protected. Clarity removes resistance. Standards define your direction, and identity determines what lasts. None of this is loud. That is why most people overlook it. But real change is not dramatic. It is precise. It happens when the mind stops obeying what is familiar and begins aligning with what is true. You do not need to force a new life. You need to remove what no longer fits. One belief at a time. One pattern at a time. One decision repeated until it becomes natural. Your mind is not fixed. It is adaptable. What was learned can be relearned. So move forward without pressure. Observe clearly. Act consistently. Let identity catch up. And when it does, change will no longer feel like effort. It will feel like you.